My name is Malik, and today I'll be your narrator, exclusively for the Red Beret. Let me tell you a story that begins not in a palace, but on a broken sidewalk beneath the blazing African sun. He was walking through the capital, surrounded by guards, advisors, and whispers, but something stopped him. A faint voice, barely audible through the noise. Ibrahim? The president turned, and what he saw nearly made his heart stop. There, sitting in a worn blanket, eyes tired but unmistakable, was a woman he hadn't seen in decades. His teacher. The one who used to read to him when his shoes were full of holes. The one who stayed after school to give him bread when he hadn't eaten. And now, she was homeless, forgotten by the world, but not by him. What happened next left the entire country speechless. Before Ibrahim Traoré became a name known across borders, before he stood at podiums and led a nation through turmoil, he was just a boy in the dusty heart of Burkina Faso, one among many, often unnoticed, often hungry, often barefoot, but never without questions. His world was small, but filled with wonder. The rustle of mango trees in the wind, the sound of chalk on worn blackboards, the warm laughter of market women, and the unspoken dreams that flickered in the eyes of children with little more than hope. He was raised by his mother, a widow who sold cassava at the market and taught him discipline with gentleness. She couldn't offer him luxury, but she gave him something far more valuable, the belief that even the poor have the right to dream boldly. From an early age, Ibrahim was curious. He would sit for hours watching ants organize themselves, then ask questions no one around him had time to answer. But there was one person who did, one person who saw in him not just another village child, but a mind waiting to be nurtured. Her name was Madame Cissé. She wasn't just a school teacher. She was a force of nature wrapped in faded cloth, with eyes sharp enough to silence a room and a heart soft enough to feed a child from her own plate. She taught under the open sky when classrooms were too full. She knew how to turn broken pencils into instruments of imagination. She kept a notebook of her students' dreams, written in her careful handwriting, as if documenting a prophecy. And in the margins of that notebook she once scribbled, "This one, Ibrahim, he's going to change the world." He didn't know she had written that. Not then. All he knew was that she stayed after class when everyone else had gone home. That she lent him books no one else thought he could read. That when he came to school in a torn shirt, she pretended not to see it, and instead praised the way he held his pen. In a region where teachers were underpaid, underappreciated, and often invisible, Madame Cissé stood tall. She was everything the system was not: patient, fierce, unwavering. And for Ibrahim, she became the foundation of everything that came after. It was her who planted the idea that leadership wasn't about control, but about service. That knowledge wasn't for the privileged, but for the persistent. And that poverty could never define a soul unless it was allowed to. As he grew older, Ibrahim carried her lessons with him like invisible armor. Through the military, through exile, through moments of doubt and fear. He would often remember how she once told him, "If the world doesn't open the door for you, build your own door, and then leave it open for others." He never told anyone how much that stayed with him, how her voice echoed in his mind even during cabinet meetings, how her strength, worn but unyielding, reminded him that real power lives in quiet sacrifice. In every school he visited as president, he looked for her, not just literally but symbolically, in the faces of other teachers who kept going despite broken chalk and broken systems. But he never found her again, not until that day on the street. Not until fate placed her right in front of him, sitting alone on a blanket, with eyes that still knew how to recognize greatness, even when it was dressed in a presidential suit. And in that moment, the years between them collapsed. She was no longer a memory. She was real, and she was in need. And Ibrahim, the boy she once fed with knowledge and bread, finally had the chance to feed her back, with justice, with dignity, and with the love she never asked for, but always deserved. It was supposed to be a simple day, a scheduled walk through the capital, a few handshakes, a few words to the press, and then back to the day's agenda. But fate has its own calendar, and sometimes the most unforgettable chapters begin in the most ordinary moments. President Ibrahim Traoré was walking down one of Ouagadougou's older streets, flanked by a small group of aides and security. He had just left a youth center and was heading toward a local health clinic when he heard it. A voice, faint, roughened by age and the wind, yet unmistakable in its cadence. Ibrahim, not Mr. President, not Your Excellency. Just his name, spoken with the same softness that once called him to the front of a dusty classroom when he was too shy to answer questions. He turned. At first he saw only a group of street dwellers gathered under the shade of a crumbling wall. Then his eyes caught hers. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Her face had aged, thinned, weathered by time and hardship, but her eyes, those eyes, had not changed. They still held the same fire, the same fierce kindness that had once shielded his childhood. Ibrahim stepped away from his entourage, his steps heavy with disbelief. She sat on a woven mat, her back hunched, a torn shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked like any other forgotten woman lost to the blind spots of society. But to him, she was a monument. "Madame Cissé," he whispered, kneeling beside her. She blinked slowly, tears welling up. "You remember me?" she said, half laughing, half crying. "Of course I do," he answered, his voice trembling. "How could I forget the woman who taught me how to believe in myself?" His security detail looked confused. His aides, stunned. None of them had ever seen him like this, vulnerable, shaken, grounded. She reached out and touched his face, as if still unsure whether what she was seeing was real. "You always had strong eyes," she murmured, "but now I see strength in your heart too." And then she began to cry, not from shame, not from pain, but from the collision of past and present, of memory and reality. Passers-by stopped to look. Some recognized the president, some recognized her. Most stood in silence, watching a scene too human to interrupt. Ibrahim didn't care about cameras, or headlines, or the eyes of the world. All he could feel was the weight of years lost. The woman who gave him light had been living in darkness. He asked gently, "What happened to you?" And she replied, "Time happened. Pension didn't come. My husband died. I moved to the city for help. There was none." Her voice cracked. "I taught hundreds, maybe thousands, but when I got sick, no one remembered me." Ibrahim closed his eyes. Rage and sorrow mixed inside him. This woman, his teacher, who had once lifted children from despair with nothing but her voice and her chalk, had been discarded. How many others like her, he wondered, were still out there, invisible to the state but unforgettable to the hearts they had shaped. "You're not alone now," he said, helping her stand. "You'll never be alone again." She leaned on him as he supported her to the waiting car, his suit brushing against her worn clothes. The media frenzy erupted within minutes. Photos of the moment spread like wildfire. "President Reunites with former homeless teacher" was the headline across Africa. But to Ibrahim, it wasn't a story, it was a reckoning. That night, he sat alone in his private office, staring at a black and white photo of his primary school class. Her face was in the back row, smiling as always. He wondered how many lives she had changed. How many presidents, doctors, artists, mothers, thinkers were out there because of her. And yet, she had ended up forgotten. No pension, no home, no respect, just fading memories and aching bones. The question haunted him. How did a nation that prides itself on education let its educators suffer in silence? The next morning, he visited her again, this time in a private hospital suite he had arranged personally. She looked better already, her cheeks less hollow, her eyes a little brighter. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. But he shook his head. "You did more for me than I ever did for you. This is not charity. This is justice." She smiled, her hands clasped over his. "Then promise me one thing," she said. "Don't forget the others, the ones who never got a second chance." He nodded deeply. "I won't." That promise would change more than just one life. It would awaken a mission. Because for Traoré, finding his teacher on the street wasn't just a personal shock, it was a national shame. And it demanded not a symbolic gesture, but a systemic response. The reunion wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, something lasting. And deep in his heart, he knew this was the moment that would define not just his presidency, but his humanity. The next few days became a whirlwind of action, emotion, and reflection. For the country, it was a viral story. For the people, it was a moment of national reckoning. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it was personal. He didn't just see Madame Cissé as a symbol of the forgotten. She was his anchor to the past, to the values that had shaped him long before politics or power entered his life. The day after reuniting with her, he cleared his schedule. No meetings, no interviews, no ceremonies. He spent the morning by her side at the hospital, reviewing her condition with doctors and listening to her recount pieces of her life he had never known. She had no children of her own. Her husband, a fellow teacher, had died years ago. With no close relatives, no stable income, and deteriorating health, she had simply faded from the system. She had slipped between the cracks until she landed on the street, where Ibrahim had found her by fate or providence. That afternoon, he returned to the presidential palace with a burning urgency. He summoned his Minister of Education, his Health Minister, and the head of the civil service. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was sharper than usual. "How many others?" he asked. "How many more Cissés are out there, surviving in silence?" The answers were vague, bureaucratic, frustrating. There had never been a proper census of retired educators. Many were unregistered. Many had died unknown. Many like her had served before digitized records even existed. "Then we start today," he said. "Find them, every single one." That was the beginning of what would become the Legacy Project, a national initiative to locate, restore, and reintegrate retired teachers who had been neglected. It began with basic steps: searching pension files, visiting old schoolhouses, placing radio announcements in local languages, asking for families to come forward. But for Ibrahim, that wasn't enough. He wanted something more immediate, something symbolic, something human. So he did what no one expected. He invited Madame Cissé to the next cabinet meeting. She arrived quietly, dressed in a new traditional dress gifted to her by the First Lady. Her posture was straighter, her eyes proud, though still cautious. As she entered the room filled with polished suits and polished egos, the ministers stood in stunned silence. Ibrahim gestured to a chair next to him. "This," he said, addressing the room, "is the woman who built this country. She didn't wear medals. She didn't command troops. But she created soldiers of the mind, leaders of thought, and today she joins us not as a guest, but as a founder of what we are trying to preserve." The room erupted in applause. Not forced, not formal, but genuine. Some ministers even wiped away tears. That day, Cissé spoke softly but clearly. She shared stories of teaching in open-air classrooms, of using torn pages from magazines to teach vocabulary, of cooking rice from her own pantry to feed children who couldn't concentrate from hunger. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then one minister said, "We forgot you, but we won't forget again." After the meeting, Ibrahim announced something else, a new title. From that day forward, Madame Cissé would serve as National Advisor for Educational Heritage, a lifetime appointment with full honors, resources, and staff. She would visit schools, train teachers, and help the government document the forgotten history of educators in Burkina Faso. The nation reacted with overwhelming pride. News channels replayed her arrival at the palace. Children drew pictures of her. Newspapers called her the Mother of Minds. But still, Ibrahim wasn't satisfied. He knew what she needed now was not just honor, but healing. He had a new house built for her, modest but beautiful, close to a school where she could visit when she wished. He visited her there one evening. She welcomed him with tea and laughter. The walls were bare, but the light in the room was rich. She looked at him and said, "Ibrahim, I always knew you'd rise, but I never imagined you'd reach back." He smiled, taking her hand. "You gave me everything. How could I not?" That night, as he left her home, a small boy from the neighborhood ran up with a flower and said, "Are you really the president?" Ibrahim knelt, smiled, and said, "Only because she taught me how to dream." It was a simple moment, but it encapsulated everything. Leadership was not about being above others. It was about lifting them. Ibrahim's response to seeing his teacher in despair wasn't just about charity or guilt. It was about a sacred responsibility to remember who had lit the way. And in doing so, he sparked something far greater than a reunion. He sparked a restoration of national memory. One woman's quiet sacrifice, one boy's rising journey, now coming full circle, reminding a nation that those who build futures must never be left behind. In the weeks following Madame Cissé's official return to public life, something extraordinary began to unfold across the nation. What started as one act of personal redemption quickly ignited a wave of collective awakening. For years, Burkina Faso, like many nations, had taken its educators for granted. They were the ones who opened their school doors at dawn, who taught children with empty stomachs, who worked without electricity, without textbooks, sometimes without pay. And yet, they rarely appeared in headlines, never sat at national tables, and were often buried quietly in the footnotes of history. But now, thanks to the reunion between a president and his former teacher, the entire country was rethinking what it meant to honor those who had shaped its foundation. In radio stations across remote provinces, elderly teachers called in to tell their stories, many for the first time in decades. Women in their 70s recounted how they used to walk for miles through the bush just to reach a village schoolhouse. Men who had long since gone silent shared memories of chalkboards made from painted tin, of students learning by candlelight, of moments when they thought no one noticed their sacrifice. The national mood shifted. Suddenly, the most respected voices were not politicians or celebrities, but the voices of those who had once whispered encouragement to children with trembling hands. Traoré, deeply moved by this response, announced a national week of tribute to educators called Les Bâtisseurs, the Builders. It would be held annually, with events in every region, each highlighting the contributions of local teachers both past and present. But he didn't stop there. He proposed a new national monument, not a statue of a general or a king, but a sculpture of an open book held by wrinkled hands, placed in the heart of Ouagadougou. The inscription would read, "To those who built us with words." The idea was approved unanimously by Parliament. Construction began within weeks. As these symbolic actions rolled forward, so did structural ones. Traoré worked with the Ministry of Finance to reallocate part of the defense budget to fund pensions for all unregistered retired educators. He established a mobile team of young civil servants who traveled to rural villages with tablets and fingerprint scanners, documenting the stories and verifying the identities of teachers who had never received formal recognition. It was slow work, often emotional, but it brought tears of joy to dozens of forgotten elders who were finally being seen. In one village, an 89-year-old man named Bako was found living in a clay hut, surviving on cassava and rainwater. He had taught mathematics for 40 years without a contract. When officials told him he was now on the pension list, he wept and said, "I taught so many boys to count, but I never thought I'd count for anything." His story was broadcast nationwide, donations flooded in. A university later named a math wing in his honor. For Traoré, these weren't political victories. They were spiritual debts being paid. And none of this would have happened without that moment, when he knelt in the street beside Madame Cissé. Their story touched more than Burkina Faso. Across Africa, similar initiatives sprang up. In Senegal, Ghana, and Uganda, ministers of education referenced Traoré's actions when launching their own programs to support retired teachers. The African Union even invited Madame Cissé to deliver a keynote at their education summit. She arrived dressed in traditional white, humble as ever, and began her speech by saying, "I am not here because I was a great teacher. I am here because one student remembered." That line struck hearts. In the audience, people stood in ovation, not just for her, but for every forgotten educator who had ever believed in a child before the world did. Meanwhile, back home, Madame Cissé continued her new role, not as a ceremonial figure, but as an active force. She spent her mornings mentoring new teachers, holding workshops on how to teach with compassion when resources are scarce. She reminded them that even a chalkboard can become a window to the stars if one teaches with love. Children across the country began writing letters to her. Some called her National Grandma. Others drew pictures of her holding a book and smiling. Her home became a place of pilgrimage for young teachers and journalists alike. Traoré often visited her in the evenings when official duties ended. They would sit under the veranda, drinking tea, watching the sun dip below the trees, talking not about politics, but about poetry, memory, and the dreams of children. One night she looked at him and said, "Ibrahim, do you think this will last?" He thought for a moment, then replied, "It will if we teach them to remember, not just to read and write, but to remember." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Nations aren't just built on laws and roads, they are built on the stories we choose to honor. And in choosing to honor hers, Traoré had not only reunited with his past, he had changed the future for thousands. Because sometimes revolutions don't begin with marches, they begin with memory. Today, Madame Cissé lives in a small but beautiful home, built by the state she once served. She wakes up early, reads poetry, and visits schools across the country to train new teachers. And sometimes, when she feels nostalgic, she opens a dusty notebook, a gift from a boy named Ibrahim who once wrote in the margins, "One day I'll make you proud." And he did. But the story doesn't end there. Because now, across Africa, stories like this are starting to bloom. Forgotten mentors being rediscovered, old promises being fulfilled, because of one man who refused to forget the hand that held him when he was small. This is Malik, your storyteller on the Red Beret. And if this story moved you, let it move your hands too. Toward respect, toward memory, toward change. Because no matter how high you rise, never forget who helped you stand. And remember, some of the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms or sit behind desks. They stand at chalkboards, in broken sandals, whispering hope into futures not yet written.